The sound of shattering glass echoed through the marble corridors as Senator Maria Rodriguez dove beneath her desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outside her office window, she could see the muzzle flashes of tactical lights cutting through the evening darkness. The Capitol building, moments ago filled with the gentle hum of late-night legislative work, now reverberated with the thunder of combat boots and shouted commands. All units, we have reports of armed insurgents in the West Wing. The radio crackled from somewhere in the hallway. Repeat, multiple hostiles, possibly coordinated attack. Maria pressed her back against the solid oak of her desk, her silk blouse damp with perspiration. 3 hours earlier, she had been celebrating. The Equity Housing Act had passed by a narrow margin, promising affordable housing for thousands of working families across the state. The community groups had gathered on the Capitol steps, their faces bright with hope, children waving handmade signs that read, "Home for everyone," and "Dreams come true." Now those same families were likely scattered, running for cover as news helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures. Dr. James Chen, the lead researcher who had spent 2 years crafting the housing legislation, crouched behind a marble pillar in the rotunda. His usually pristine suit jacket was torn at the shoulder where he had stumbled during the initial chaos. The emergency lights cast eerie shadows across the ornate ceiling, transforming the familiar space into something alien and threatening. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered to Assembly member Patricia Williams, who had taken shelter behind the same pillar. Her dark skin glistened with sweat, her usually perfect afro disheveled from their frantic escape down the service stairwell. "None of this makes sense," Patricia replied, her voice barely audible above the distant shouting. "Who would attack us tonight? We were just signing paperwork." The initial 911 call had come in at 8:47 p.m., just as Governor Thompson was preparing to add his signature to the historic legislation. Karen Whitmore, a 53-year-old insurance adjuster from the affluent Riverside district, had dialed emergency services with a voice trembling with apparent terror. "There are armed militants storming the Capitol." She had gasped into her phone, standing in the parking lot of a coffee shop 6 blocks away from the building. "I saw them, dozens of them, carrying assault weapons. They're screaming about overthrowing the government. Oh my God, they're shooting at the police." The 911 operator, trained to prioritize public safety above all else, had immediately dispatched every available unit. Within 12 minutes, the Capitol was surrounded by a perimeter of flashing red and blue lights. SWAT teams in full tactical gear had breached every entrance, their weapons trained on shadows and empty hallways. Karen had provided a chilling description to the responding officers. "They looked like gang members," she had said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that remained mysteriously dry. "Young men, mostly Hispanic and black, carrying military-style weapons. They were chanting something in Spanish, talking about taking back what was stolen from them." Her words had spread through the police radio network like wildfire. The state had experienced several high-profile incidents of political violence in recent months, and the authorities were taking no chances. The National Guard was placed on standby. The FBI's domestic terrorism unit was notified. Inside the Capitol, Governor Thompson had been rushed to a secure location by his security detail, the unsigned legislation left abandoned on his desk like a forgotten promise. The community leaders who had waited patiently in the gallery to witness this historic moment found themselves face down on the floor, their hands zip-tied behind their backs as officers demanded to know their affiliations and intentions. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, a 62-year-old grandmother who had campaigned tirelessly for affordable housing after her family was priced out of their neighborhood, felt the cold marble against her cheek as an officer's knee pressed into her back. "Please," she wheezed, her English accented but clear. "We are not criminals. We are citizens." "Ma'am, you need to remain silent," the officer replied, his voice muffled by his tactical helmet. "We're going to sort this out, but right now everyone is a potential threat." The irony was not lost on Elena. She had fled political persecution in El Salvador 30 years earlier, seeking the safety and freedom that America promised. Now, at the moment of her greatest civic triumph, she found herself treated like an enemy of the state. Social media exploded with speculation and fear. Grainy cell phone videos showed armored vehicles surrounding the Capitol, their emergency lights painting the neoclassical facade in harsh, alternating colors. Twitter users shared unverified reports of gunfire, of legislators barricaded in their offices, of a coordinated attack on democracy itself. Breaking armed coup attempt at state capitol. Read one viral tweet. Minority extremists attempt to overthrow government during critical vote. "Civil war has begun," declared another. "Patriots needed now to defend our institutions." The hashtag Joshua Capitol Under Siege began trending within an hour, accompanied by increasingly inflammatory rhetoric from political commentators and conspiracy theorists who had been waiting for exactly this kind of crisis to validate their darkest predictions. Inside the building, the lockdown stretched through the night like a living nightmare. Senator Rodriguez remained hidden beneath her desk, her legs cramping from the uncomfortable position. She had tried calling her chief of staff, her husband, her children, but the cell towers were overwhelmed by the emergency response. Each unanswered ring felt like another step toward an abyss she couldn't name. Dr. Chen and Assemblymember Williams had been joined by several other legislators in the rotunda, all of them trying to make sense of the chaos that had erupted around them. Through the tall windows, they could see news vans arriving in convoy formation, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky like metallic flowers seeking sunlight. "My daughter's probably watching this on the news right now," Patricia whispered, thinking of her 10-year-old at home with a babysitter. "She's going to be terrified." "We all are," replied Congressman Michael Torres, a veteran of the Iraq War who had thought his days of taking cover from gunfire were behind him. "But something about this doesn't add up. Where are the shots? Where are the actual threats?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and persistent. Hours had passed since the initial breach, but no weapons had been found, no insurgents captured, no demands issued. The tactical teams continued their methodical sweep of the building, their radios buzzing with reports of empty rooms and abandoned offices. At 2:17 a.m., Detective Sarah Kim made a discovery that would change everything. While reviewing security footage from the evening's events, she noticed something peculiar about the 911 caller's account. Karen Whitmore had claimed to witness the attack from the north side of the Capitol, but the timestamp showed she had been on the south side when she made the call, in the parking lot of a coffee shop that closed at 8 p.m. More disturbing was what Kim found on Karen's social media accounts. At 7:23 p.m., just over an hour before her frantic call to emergency services, Karen had posted in a private Facebook group called Patriotic Citizens for Real America. The post was a screenshot of a news article about the housing legislation, accompanied by a message that made Kim's blood run cold. "This communist takeover ends tonight. Sometimes you have to create a crisis to save the country. Follow my lead." The responses from other group members revealed a coordinated effort to flood social media with false reports of violence and armed insurgency. Phone records showed that several group members had called local news stations claiming to have witnessed shootings and explosions, providing vivid but entirely fabricated accounts of urban warfare. Detective Kim immediately called her supervisor, Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, who was coordinating the response from the mobile command center outside the Capitol. "You're telling me this whole thing is a hoax?" Walsh asked, her voice tight with exhaustion and growing anger. "Not just a hoax," Kim replied, scrolling through more evidence on her laptop. "A deliberate false flag operation designed to stop the legislation from being signed. Karen Whitmore has been planning this for weeks." The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Chat logs showed Karen discussing the optimal timing for her call, the specific language that would trigger the maximum law enforcement response, and the importance of describing the alleged attackers in racial terms that would inflame existing tensions. "We need to hit them where it hurts," she had written in one message. "Make it about race. Make it about immigration. Make it so scary that they'll never try to pass another bleeding heart law again." Her co-conspirators had enthusiastically embraced the plan. They had created fake social media accounts to amplify the false reports, contacted sympathetic media personalities to promote the crisis narrative, and even prepared press releases blaming radical leftist violence for the attack. Lieutenant Walsh felt a surge of fury that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. She had deployed every available officer, activated emergency protocols that cost the city thousands of dollars per hour, and traumatized innocent citizens based on lies fabricated by a woman who couldn't tolerate the democratic process when it didn't serve her interests. "Bring her in," Walsh ordered. "Now!" Karen Whitmore was arrested at 3:45 a.m. at her suburban home, still wearing the same clothes she had worn to stage her false flag operation. When officers knocked on her door, they found her wide awake, obsessively refreshing news websites and social media feeds to monitor the impact of her deception. "I was protecting America," she declared as the handcuffs closed around her wrists. "Those people were trying to destroy our way of life with their socialist agenda. Those people were exercising their constitutional rights," Officer David Martinez replied, his voice steady despite his anger. "And you just committed multiple felonies to silence them." The arrest triggered a cascade of revelations that exposed the full scope of the conspiracy. Federal investigators, initially called in to investigate domestic terrorism, pivoted to examine what prosecutors would later describe as one of the most elaborate hoaxes in state political history. Karen's co-conspirators, faced with federal charges including conspiracy to obstruct government proceedings and making false statements to law enforcement, began cooperating with investigators. They revealed a network of similar operations planned for other states, where progressive legislation was advancing through the democratic process. The evidence painted a picture of systematic attempts to weaponize law enforcement and emergency services against political opponents, using fabricated crises to justify authoritarian responses to legitimate governance. As dawn broke over the Capitol, the lockdown was finally lifted. Exhausted legislators emerged from their hiding places like survivors of a natural disaster, their faces pale and their clothes wrinkled from a night of fear and confusion. Governor Thompson, his gray hair disheveled and his usually pristine suit rumpled beyond recognition, called an emergency press conference on the Capitol steps. Behind him, the building that had been transformed into a fortress just hours earlier was already returning to its normal function, with maintenance crews sweeping up broken glass and security guards resuming their regular patrols. "Last night, our democratic institutions were attacked," the governor began, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and righteous anger. "But the attack did not come from armed insurgents or foreign enemies. It came from citizens of our own state who were willing to terrorize their neighbors and waste public resources rather than accept the results of the democratic process." The crowd of reporters, many of whom had spent the night broadcasting increasingly hysterical speculation about civil war and governmental collapse, listened with a mixture of relief and embarrassment as the governor detailed the conspiracy that had manipulated them all. Karen Whitmore and her accomplices exploited our legitimate concerns about public safety to advance their political agenda. Thompson continued, "They weaponized fear itself, turning our protections against us and using our own emergency services as instruments of oppression." The community leaders who had been zip-tied and interrogated just hours earlier stood beside the governor, their presence a powerful rebuke to the forces that had tried to silence them. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, despite the ordeal she had endured, spoke with quiet dignity about the importance of persevering in the face of hatred and deception. "They tried to make us afraid," she said, her accented English carrying across the crowd with surprising strength. "They wanted us to believe that seeking justice makes us criminals, that fighting for our families makes us terrorists. But we are not afraid. We are Americans, and we will not be silenced." The investigation that followed revealed the staggering scope of the conspiracy. Phone records showed that Karen and her network had made over 200 false reports to emergency services across 3 states, attempting to disrupt government proceedings and intimidate political opponents. The financial cost of their deception exceeded $2 million in emergency response resources, not including the immeasurable damage to community trust and civic participation. Federal prosecutors, working with state authorities, filed charges under the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, citing the conspiracy's attempt to intimidate or coerce a civilian population and influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. Karen Whitmore, as the ringleader of the operation, faced up to 20 years in federal prison. The psychological impact of the hoax extended far beyond its immediate targets. Children in the affected communities experienced nightmares and anxiety attacks, their sense of safety shattered by images of their parents and grandparents being treated as criminals. Community organizations reported a sharp decline in civic participation as people became afraid to engage with government processes that had been weaponized against them. But the conspiracy also sparked an unprecedented mobilization of community solidarity. The Equity Housing Act, which had been the original target of Karen's deception, became a symbol of resilience against authoritarian manipulation. Support for the legislation grew dramatically as people recognized it as a victim of the same forces that threatened their own democratic participation. Dr. James Chen, who had spent the night hiding behind a marble pillar, found himself transformed from a policy researcher into an accidental hero of democratic resistance. His calm, factual responses to media interviews helped counter the inflammatory rhetoric that had fueled the crisis, and his detailed explanations of the legislation's benefits reached audiences who might never have paid attention under normal circumstances. "Fear is the enemy of democracy," he told a packed auditorium at the State University 3 weeks after the crisis. "When we allow fear to override facts, when we let hatred silence hope, we surrender the very principles that make our society worth defending." The legal proceedings against Karen and her co-conspirators became a civic education opportunity, as prosecutors methodically documented how disinformation campaigns could be used to subvert democratic institutions. The trial, broadcast live on multiple news networks, provided a real-time lesson in the importance of media literacy and critical thinking in an age of information warfare. Karen's defense team attempted to portray her as a patriotic citizen who had been genuinely concerned about public safety. But the evidence of premeditation and coordination undermined any claim of good faith, while expert testimony about the psychological impact of her deception highlighted the true violence inherent in her actions. Words have consequences, testified Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a psychologist who had treated several of the traumatized community members. When you deliberately create terror in innocent people, when you use the apparatus of the state to intimidate and oppress, you are committing a form of violence that can be just as harmful as physical assault. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Karen Whitmore was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, while her co-conspirators received terms ranging from 3 to 8 years, depending on their level of involvement. More importantly, the conspiracy's exposure led to systematic reforms in emergency response protocols and media verification procedures. Law enforcement agencies implemented new training programs to help officers recognize and respond to fabricated threats, while news organizations adopted stricter standards for reporting unconfirmed claims of violence or terrorism. The Equity Housing Act, which had been delayed but not defeated by Karen's deception, was finally signed into law 6 months later in a ceremony that deliberately celebrated the triumph of democratic process over authoritarian manipulation. The signing took place not in the governor's private office, but on the same Capitol steps where the community leaders had originally gathered to celebrate their victory. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, now recognized as a symbol of civic courage, was given the honor of introducing Governor Thompson before he signed the legislation. Her speech, delivered in both English and Spanish, became a viral sensation that reached millions of viewers around the world. "They tried to steal our voices," she said, her words carrying the weight of personal experience and collective hope. "They wanted us to be afraid of our own government, afraid of our own neighbors, afraid of our own dreams. But fear is not stronger than truth. Hatred is not stronger than love. And lies are not stronger than the courage of people who refuse to be silenced." As she spoke, the crowd that had gathered for the signing grew beyond the capacity of the Capitol steps. Families that had been targeted by the conspiracy stood alongside supporters who had been moved by their courage. Children who had witnessed their parents being treated as criminals now saw them recognized as heroes of democratic participation. The ceremony concluded with the reading of letters from communities across the nation that had experienced similar attacks on their democratic processes. From rural townships, where false reports had been used to intimidate immigrant families, to urban centers, where fabricated threats had been deployed to suppress voter registration drives. The pattern of abuse was both widespread and systematic. But the letters also contained stories of resilience and resistance, of communities that had refused to be intimidated, and democratic institutions that had survived their greatest tests. The conspiracy that had begun as an attempt to silence the voices of the marginalized had ultimately amplified them, creating a national conversation about the importance of protecting democratic participation from authoritarian manipulation. In the months that followed, the Capitol crisis became a case study in political science courses, journalism schools, and law enforcement academies across the country. The systematic documentation of how disinformation could be weaponized against democratic institutions provided valuable insights for defending against future attacks. Karen Whitmore, serving her sentence in federal prison, became an unwilling symbol of the dangers of political extremism and the consequences of choosing hatred over democracy. Her co-conspirators, most of whom had been motivated more by social media validation than ideological conviction, found themselves grappling with the real-world impact of their online rhetoric. But the lasting legacy of the crisis was not the damage it had caused, but the strength it had revealed in the communities that had survived it. The families who had been terrorized by false accusations became leaders in civic engagement, their experience providing them with unique insights into the importance of protecting democratic institutions from authoritarian abuse. Dr. Chen continued his work on housing policy, but his research now included studies of how political violence and intimidation affected community participation in government processes. His findings contributed to a growing body of scholarship on the relationship between democratic participation and social justice, helping to inform policies that would make government more accessible and responsive to all citizens. Senator Rodriguez, who had spent the night hiding beneath her desk, became a leading advocate for emergency response reform and domestic terrorism prevention. Her legislation, requiring law enforcement agencies to verify threats before deploying tactical responses, was adopted in 12 states and became a model for federal policy reform. Assemblymember Williams channeled her experience into educational outreach, speaking at schools and community centers about the importance of civic engagement and the dangers of political extremism. Her children's book about the night of the crisis, written in collaboration with several other affected families, became a bestseller and helped parents across the country discuss difficult topics about democracy, truth, and courage with their children. The coffee shop, where Karen had staged her false flag operation, was transformed into a community center dedicated to media literacy and civic education. The irony was intentional and powerful. The site of deception had become a beacon of truth. The location of division had become a center of unity, and the starting point of hatred had become a foundation for hope. 5 years after the Capitol crisis, Governor Thompson delivered his final State of the State address in the same chamber where legislators had once cowered in fear. The building had been renovated and expanded, but the memorial plaque in the rotunda served as a permanent reminder of the night when democracy had been tested and emerged stronger. We learned that our institutions are only as strong as the people who defend them, Thompson said in his concluding remarks. We learned that truth is more powerful than lies, that courage is more contagious than fear, and that the arc of justice bends toward hope when ordinary citizens choose to do extraordinary things. In the gallery, Mrs. Elena Vasquez listened with her granddaughter on her lap, the next generation already learning the lessons that their elders had purchased with their courage. The child would grow up in a world where her grandmother was recognized as a hero, where her family's struggle for justice was part of the historical record, and where democracy had proven stronger than the forces that sought to destroy it. The Equity Housing Act had exceeded all projections, providing affordable homes for over 30,000 families and creating a model that was being replicated in states across the nation. But more importantly, it had become a symbol of what was possible when communities refused to be intimidated, and democratic institutions functioned as they were designed to function. As the session adjourned and the legislators filed out of the chamber, the evening sun cast long shadows across the marble floors where SWAT teams had once searched for phantom terrorists. The building hummed with the normal sounds of democracy, conversations about policy and procedure, debates about budgets and bureaucracy, negotiations between people who disagreed about methods but shared a commitment to the democratic process. Outside, children played on the Capitol lawn where their parents had once been zip-tied and interrogated. Tour groups paused at the memorial plaque to learn about the night when democracy had faced one of its greatest tests and emerged victorious. And in the distance, the sun set on a community that had learned the most important lesson of all, that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that the cost of democracy is the courage to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The crisis had ended not with violence or revolution, but with something far more powerful: the quiet persistence of people who refused to let fear overcome hope, who chose truth over comfort, and who understood that democracy is not a destination, but a journey that each generation must undertake for themselves. In the end, Karen Whitmore's attempt to destroy had only served to create Her effort to divide had only strengthened unity, and her campaign of hatred had only deepened the community's commitment to love. The Capitol crisis had become not a cautionary tale about democracy's fragility, but a testament to its resilience and a reminder that the truth, no matter how long delayed, will always find its way to light.